I have the task to introduce him. I'm not sure this is really necessary, but I will do, or I will say a few words about this. So Pierre André is presently a professor at Columbia University. This is a named chair, a named professorship, but the name is very complicated, so I will not say the name. And he is also present in the French system since last year. He was accepted as a member of the Académie des sciences morales et politiques. So Pierre André is one of our academicians, not an academic, an academician, which is very different. So this is really very impressive two positions. But on top of that, if you look at his bio or his CV, then you'll find that he's associated to many learned societies. He's a fellow of Econometric Society, European Economic Association, etc. He's a doctor honoris causa from Laval University in Canada. And among all the honors that he received, I could not miss first the Order of Saint Charles. He's a Knight of the Order of Saint Charles. If you don't know what the Saint Charles Order is, this is the most prestigious award that you can get when you are a Monaco citizen, which is the case of Pierre André. And the second very honorific title is that he is a chairman of the Scientific Council of the Paris School of Economics. And I'm not sure that there is any more prestigious position in the world than this one. Now, if you look at his intellectual production, it is quite amazing. It's very difficult to give any summary of that. There are something like 100 papers, most of them in the most prestigious journals of this profession. And those papers are covering several areas. One area, of course, is a famous collective household model, which is something which is really the creation of Pierre André and has been very influential for all the people who worked in household economics. Linked to this collective model and the fact that this model is looking at intra-household issues, he has many papers on the marriage, the theory of marriage, and of course from marriage to matchmaking. So this is a second huge area in his production. But there is more than that. He has been for a long time one of the experts in insurance economics. He has published books on insurance, as a matter of fact, very early in his career. And he has even been involved in some practical consultancy on insurance. Fourth area is really more mathematical, and this is the work done partly with Roger Guenry on the sunspots. I mean, the theory of expectations to a large extent. And I will not say anything about the last big area, because I must say that it's completely Hebrew to me, because this is something called the exterior differential calculus. And I don't even know what this can be about. So, but I know, looking at the publication, that there are several of them, many of them with our colleague and friend Ivar Ekland. Now, on top of that, you have a couple of books. And there is a book I mentioned on the insurance. I should say first, there is a book which has not been very successful, which we wrote together, Pierre André and myself, which was supposed to be the utmost textbook in microeconomics, and has been a complete flop. But so let's forget about this. But about the successful books published by Pierre André, there was the one on insurance that I mentioned. There is one on the economics of the family with some co-authors. And I believe that everybody will be very pleased by the last book that he published, which is about is it about matchmaking? Matching with transfers. But the nice thing in this book is not the title, it is a subtitle, which says The Economics of Love and Marriage. The bad thing about that is that you learn when you look at the book that in the economics of love and marriage, the most important thing is divorce. But okay, forget about this. And I leave the floor to Pierre André, and we're very happy to have him with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. About this book, one thing, the original title was Matching with Transfers. The publisher was the Princeton University Press, and whomever was in charge in publishing at Princeton told me that's the most unsexy title I've seen in my life. Find a subtitle. So I sent an email to Richard Blundell, who was the head of the collection, and he said, The Economics of Love and Marriage. So I have no responsibility in the subtitle, especially because there is not much love in my book. I mean, not much formalization of, well, there is love, but love is a random shock, which, might be a good description. Okay, today I'm gonna talk a little bit about this. As you know, there has been a lot of work recently, and this is, of course, one of the foremost places in which this work took place about inequality. There is a lot of work on the absolute top of the distribution, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and here the emphasis was put on financial wealth. So the basic argument was if the interest rate is larger than the growth rate, then essentially the percentage of individual wealth in the economy will grow mechanically. That's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what David Autor called the remaining 99%. There has been a lot of increase in inequality in many countries, but there are basically two general patterns. There is the Chinese pattern, and the Chinese pattern, essentially, there is an increase in inequality, but all revenues are growing. The top revenue are growing faster than the bottom one, but the increase in inequality goes together with an increase in income for everyone, which makes it probably more acceptable. But there is, what I'm going to talk about is in a sense, the opposite model, which is the US. And in the US, what you see is that the top revenues, top incomes are growing, but the bottom income are not. Actually, they are stagnating at best, and if not decreasing. The one thing I want to emphasize is the role of human capital, which of course will at the end bring me back to the family and to my financial topic. This is a general, most of you are economists, so you know what's human capital, but in case you want a reminder, this is a definition I picked up in Wikipedia. And it's pretty good. That's exactly what we want to talk about. It's education. It's not only education because you can acquire human capital on the job. So when you work, you acquire some knowledge, some skills, and so on. And that's part of human capital. But the important thing, which was pointed out by Gary Becker half a century ago, is that it's an investment. It's not something you're born with. It's something you invest into. And that's something that I'm going to emphasize a lot. So what I'm going to do today is two things. First of all, I talked about inequality. I will give you some numbers. That's going to be, essentially, I will give you graphs. And I will comment the graphs a little bit. But I will try to give you a general picture, what I will call 5 stylized facts. On the way, I will talk a lot about the importance of human capital in the description of this inequality. But then the second part of my talk, I will talk about human capital as an economist. And it's an investment. If it's an investment, we need to look at the incentives to invest and the technology of production of human capital. And of course, there will be a lot of links with the economics of the family, and more generally with anything that has to do with homogamy. And at the end, I will conclude with a more long-term perspective about what I call the inequality spiral. But if you survive until then, you will see what I mean. Okay, let me start with the global picture. Those are the 5 facts I'm going to talk about. First of all, the fact that there is a before the 70s and there is 80s and after. Second thing, the key role of human capital in the current inequality and also in the evolution of the inequality about during the last 4 decades. By the way, I'm talking about the US. The picture in France would be quite different. And if you wish, at the end, we might talk about this. But in the US, what's pretty clear is that the price of skill, the price of human capital has exploded over the last 4 or 5 decades. Why? I will tell you a very simple story. That's not mine. It's a story essentially due to people Larry Katz, Claudia Goldin, David Autor, and so on. It will be a very simple supply and demand, but you'll see that it's pretty convincing. I will talk about social mobility. There is this myth, which is the US as a land of opportunity. So we know that there is a lot of inequality, but on the other hand, it's the price to pay for a society which is very mobile and in which even if you start at the bottom, you have a good chance of making it to the top. Let's see what the data tell us. And finally, I will talk about urbanization and vote. Given the current US context, it's very hard not to talk about voting patterns. So I'm going to say a few words about votes. So, again, this is the US. This is entirely in level. I'm not interested in trend. So the basic 1973 is taken as the basis 100. If you look at the first part, which is what French people call les Trente Glorieuses, first of all, you got this incredible growth. The real income essentially doubles over 30 years. That, at that time, was completely unprecedented. What's even more striking is that if you look at the top, the median, and the bottom of the distribution, they grow at exactly the same pace. It's hard to distinguish those 3 lines. And you see this complete change in the late 70s, early 80s. You got this diffraction. The top one continued to grow pretty much at the same rate. At the bottom, at best, it stagnates, which means that the inequality here has been increasing a lot. Now, if you look at the numbers of inequality, on this graph, the number here is the level of inequality. The measure here is the 9th decile divided by the 10th decile. So I'm absolutely not talking about the absolute top, right? That's the number is this ratio in 1980, and the size of the bar is the evolution since then. And what you see is that the US used to be quite unequal, not as much as Korea, but in terms of increase, it's way beyond every other country. The second is being the United Kingdom. Good news, France actually inequality by this measure decreased over the period. So much for this so-called explosion of inequality in France. Now, those are not very satisfactory measures for the following reason. The way you get those kind of numbers is you take a cross-section, okay? The problem with the cross-section is you got a lot of transitory income, which is in there, and you completely miss any kind of life cycle profile. Think, for instance, of an ideal economy in which everybody, each individual has exactly the same career. They start very low, then their income grows, and at the end, when they retire, their income is very high, right? This is an economy in which there is zero inequality. Everybody has the same career. Yet, if you look at the cross-section, you will see a bunch of wealthy people, the old one, and a bunch of poor people, the young ones. My point here is if we really want to measure inequality, the right measure is not in terms of current income, it's in terms of what Friedman called permanent income, lifetime income. Now, this is something that can be done in the US because we have this wonderful database, which is the PSID, which has been created by the University of Michigan back in the 60 or 70, but they have retrospective questions. So we have a bunch of people whom we have been following continuously, the same people, for 7 decades. Now, what you can do then is you take a young guy, let's normalize this at age 25, and you compute the value, the current value when he's entering the labor market of the future wages that he will receive. And you could define the decile using this permanent income, and then you can look at the evolution. That has been done in a beautiful paper by Fatih Gouvnen and co-author. And that's one of the most disturbing graphs I've seen in the recent years. So this number here is the value of an ideal worker belonging to the 75th percentile and reaching born in 45, reaching the age 25 in 1960. It's the current value of all his future income. Now, part of the American myth is, I have a very hard life, but the next generation will do better. And that's true for the top. The top, you see exactly what you would expect. The next generation is doing better. You go as high as the 75th percentage, it's flat, and below is decreasing. That's quite amazing. We're not talking, about short-term fluctuation, transitory income. We're not even talking about the slope of your career. We're talking about lifetime inequalities. Note also that this is for men. The story for women is completely different, and I'll come back to that later on, to this very strange asymmetry between men and women. Okay, human capital. The bottom one tells you the higher your education, the higher your income. That's not very surprising. Perhaps more surprising, if you look at the top, that's the unemployment rate. As you know, the unemployment rate is low in the US. It's below 4%. But if you have a doctoral degree or an MBA or a law degree or whatever, it's basically zero. This 1.5%, it's essentially transitory unemployment. You're moving from a job to the other one. If you have zero education, high school dropout, it's more, it's 7%. Now, this is all ages. Among this lot here, you got people who didn't have an education, but acquired a lot of human capital on the job. They've been working in some kind of job for 20 years, and they have some skills which are not the product of education, but they still have some human capital. If you look at exactly the same graph for young people, so not only they don't have education, but they didn't have time to acquire this human capital on the job, it's not 7%, it's 15%. By the way, that's the US number. In France, it would be more than 40% unemployment. My impression, I'm not a specialist of French data, but my impression is that the main difference that education makes in France is in terms of unemployment, employability, and so on. This graph tells you to try to measure, in all modern economies, wages are impacted by education. If you have more education, your wage will be higher, but the magnitude of this effect differs across the economy, and it's much stronger in the US, for instance, than in Northern Europe. Keep that in mind, I'll come back to that. Okay, that was static, now the dynamics. This is the college premium. The college premium is defined as the wage of someone who has, remember that college in the US is 4 years of university, right? It's nothing to do with the collège in France. Yeah. So that's the wage you get if you have the average wage for people who have a training of at least 4 years in a university, divided by people who just started working after high school. This is very imperfect because, in particular, there are plenty of selection that has not correct. Those are just raw data. Yet, the story they tell is quite simple. That's 22%. So, in other words, back in the 72, the fact that you are entering the labor market with a college degree instead of just high school and increasing your wage by 22%. Now, it's not negligible because it's 22% throughout your life. But yet, now it's 70. So the college premium has been multiplied by more than 3. And the story is the same among women, except that the evolution is less spectacular from 40% to 80%, so it just doubles. That say there is much more selection here than there, because the number of women attending college has increased a lot, whereas the number of men attending college has not changed much. So what we see is the market price of human capital has been exploding over the period. Again, that's a US phenomenon, and I don't think that's true in France. But so, how can we explain this? Oh, this is the same graph, but in value. So this is the current value when you just walk out of your college with your college degree, that the value of this college degree in terms of additional lifetime income, of course, discounted, everything is in 2009 dollars. This is net of tuition. I hear often that tuition are way too expensive in U.S. universities, and it's no longer worth going to university given the crazy level of tuition. First of all, tuitions are very high in some universities, including mine, which is very good because it allows to pay good wages to local professors. But yet, even net of tuition, investing in higher education is by far the best investment you can make. Much more now than was the case 30, 40 years ago. So education has much more value now than in the past. And I think that's a fact, even if you control for selection and you try to dig into this, that's a very salient fact. Why? And we know, we want to explain this. We're economists. We believe in a very simple message, which is supply and demand. So let's first look at demand. This graph is due to David Autor from MIT. So what he does is, he takes all the jobs in the US. Some jobs are part-time, some jobs are full-time, so some jobs are full-time plus overtime. So instead of taking the jobs, he takes the number of hours worked in the US. So there are, billions of them. And he asks himself what percentage of those hours require a college degree or more. Back in 64, the percentage was less than 20%. Now it's more than 50%. What this tells you is, from the economy, from the demand side, there's been a huge increase in the demand for skilled work and for human capital. Why that? That's an open question. Obviously, technical progress, probably to some extent international trade, specialization, and so on. But at the end of the day, this is the demand side, and the evolution is quite spectacular. What happens on the supply side? Well, here, coming back to my point before, there is a huge asymmetry between men and women. We see a huge increase in human capital investment by women, and we don't see much by men. By the way, this is a trend in basically all developed countries, and this is something that no one talks about. I do believe that it's one of the most spectacular kind of economic phenomenon of the last 4 decades. Look at this graph here. This is from a paper by Gary Becker, Herbert, and Kevin Murphy. So the poor countries are on the left, the rich countries are on the right, and the criterion is per capita GDP below or above the median. For each decade, the size of the bar is the percentage of the population with a college degree, the dark blue men, the light blue women. In rich country, women are now more educated than men. And even in poor countries, we're not yet there, but the trend is pretty clear. Right? Now, if you look at the US, it's even more spectacular. So what we did for this graph is you take any year between 68, we take the CPS, from between 68 and 2010, and you look at the population age 30 to 40, so that you're sure that those people are done with their education, and you look at the percentage of people with some college, in French it will be Bac plus 2, college, and more than college, law degree, medicine degree, MBA, PhD, and so on. Men are in blue, women are in red. So first of all, you see the overtaking of men by women here, there, and even at the highest level. But very striking is, if you look at this red rectangle here, right? This is a period on which the college plus premium, so we're not talking college, we're going beyond college, grad degree, right? This premium has increased even faster than the college premium. The market reward for this level of education has really exploded. Now, we're economists who believe in incentives, so we expect that as a result, investment is becoming much more profitable. We expect that people are going to invest more. And you see that big time for women. Here, the number is about 4%, now it's 12%. It's multiplied by 3 over 30 years. Believe me, that's really a huge increase. But what's even more striking is that for men, if anything, you see a slight decline. Interesting, huh? You face men and women with exactly the same incentives, and they behave in completely different way. One explanation, by the way, could be, but the college premium on the labor market is essentially a female phenomenon. We see that for female and not for men. That's not in the data. As I showed you, the male college premium, if anything, increased faster than the college premium. So we have this asymmetry between genders that we need to explain. Okay, anyway, if you take this story and you apply Econ 101, what happens when demand increases and supply doesn't follow, or only partly follow? Well, essentially, the price goes up, which is exactly what we see. Now, of course, by exactly the same token, if you look at the low-skilled people, we see that the demand actually has declined, at least in relative terms, and that's explained the fact that the price of low skill has in fact decreased over the period. Okay, now, probably the more interesting aspect of all this, social mobility. Let me come back to this notion of the US as a land of opportunity. So they decided that, okay, we have a lot of inequality now, that's the price to pay for a very mobile society. And at the end of the day, I will do better, and more importantly, my kid will do better. That, a society in which, whichever level you're starting from, you still have a decent chance to make it to the top. Now, we economists measure this by the elasticity of children income to parents' income. In other words, assume that you try to guess the income of the children, and the only thing you know is the income of the parents. How much information does this knowledge give you? And in a very mobile society, the answer is not much. You might know the income of the parents, since there is this lot of mobility and reshuffling of the cards and everything, so the elasticity will be small, something like never 0, but 0.1, 0.2, something like this. In a very frozen society, you would expect just the opposite. The indication of the parents, the income of the parents tells me a lot about the income. It could go all the way to 50%, something like this. So what I'm going to give you is the graph in which on the horizontal axis, I will put the current level of inequality, still measured by my ratio. And on the vertical axis, I will put mobility. Now remember that the higher a country is on this graph, the less social mobility we have. So the story is that there are some kind of unequal but mobile countries on the one hand, and on the other hand, those countries are much less unequal, but in a sense more frozen, with much less intergenerational mobility, should give me a graph that's decreasing. I would like the graph to be decreasing. So that will be my first graph. My second graph, I will take the horizontal axis, and instead of the index of inequality, I'm going to put the importance of education and wages. That just because I want something like a hint about the impact of human capital in the story. So my first graph, and this is just a reminder of how we measure. So my first graph, which I hoped would be decreasing, that was called by the late Alan Kruger the Great Gatsby curve. Because in the Gatsby, the novel by Fitzgerald, he starts as really at the bottom, he's the son of a bootlegger or whatever, and makes it to the top of society and whatever. But anyway, not only the US are the most unequal among the countries, among the developed countries here. By the way, François knows that infinitely more better than I do, but some developing countries are much more unequal than the United States, like Brazil, for instance. But among the developed country, United States is not only the most unequal one, but also one of the least mobile ones, together with United Kingdom and Italy. Italy is a paradox, you'll see why in a minute. But there are lands of opportunities, by the way, here. New Zealand, Australia, Canada. Those are the countries in which you have a high level of inequality, but a lot of social mobility. But that's not the case of the US, and I doubt that it has been the case of the US for the last 50, 60 years. So maybe this dream of the land of opportunity was true at the beginning of the 20th century. Not sure we have the data to check that, but definitely it's no longer the case. Of course, the beautiful countries here, in which you don't have much inequality and a lot of social mobility, are Northern European countries. Okay, now, so as I said, I'm replacing the horizontal axis, and I'm putting the impact of human capital on wages, and pretty much it's the same story. Those countries that are unequal and not mobile are precisely the country in which the college premium is very high. And this is a correlation on raw data. I'm not implying any causality here. But still, it strongly suggests that there should be a correlation between, on the one hand, the importance of human capital, and on the other hand, the absence of social mobility. And that's exactly what will be the topic of my talk, that the main mechanism by which inequality perpetuates and actually increases, what I call the inequality spiral, is human capital acquisition. Fine, Italy is fun, huh? Apparently, Italy, it has nothing to do with your level of education. It could be something else, but no, I'm not going to talk about Italy, although it's a very inspiring topic. Okay, now my last series of stylized facts. So those are slides that I borrowed from my friend Ed Glaser from Harvard. It's about urbanization. One thing that's very striking in the US evolution over the last 30, 40 years is the concentration of wealth, and in particular of wealth creation in large urban centers. So I'll give you a few graphs that illustrate this. As a result, the educated people tend more and more to concentrate in big cities. And then I will talk a little bit about the impact on votes, and you'll see it's quite spectacular. It's always been the case that there is more per capita GDP in urban centers than in rural areas. But if you look over time, so this is the types of job, low skills, mid skills, and high skills by concentration. So the big cities are here and the rural areas are here, and you got the 70s, which is in blue, all the way to the most recent, which is here. What you see in particular is that mid skills decrease now with the size of with the urbanization, whereas they used to increase 40 years ago. And it's always been the case. There always been a positive gradient here, in the sense that high-skilled jobs were slightly more likely to be in big cities, but it was not very strong back in the 70s, and now it's much more visible. This is in terms of labor force. The high school dropout are in red, and the college educated are in blue. So first of all, now there are more college educated people than high school dropout, but you see the gradient here. The difference between rural and urban has been amplified absolutely remarkably over the last decade. So the skilled people, they concentrate in New York, they concentrate in San Francisco, they concentrate in Boston, Seattle, and places like this. That's it used to be the case back in the 70s that wages were higher in in large cities, whatever your level of skills, including the lowest level of skill. Now it's no longer the case. You still have this huge increase of wages. If you're skilled, you don't see anything about low-skilled people, which means that it becomes very difficult for a low-skilled person to find housing in San Francisco, which is one of the main problems of the Bay Area. As a result, inequality within city has increased a lot. New York, San Jose, San Francisco. Fairfield, Connecticut might seem a bit strange, but Fairfield, Connecticut is New York. Actually, there are lots of very wealthy investment traders who work in Wall Street and commute to Fairfield, Connecticut. Votes. Now, this is quite impressive too. You take all the electoral districts. Some are Republican, some are Democratic, and pretty much it's 50-50, right? But in terms of GDP per district or median household income, back in 2008, there was not much difference. If anything, in terms of median income, the Republican districts were slightly higher. But over the last decade, the wealth in democratic district has increased a lot, 36%, whereas in the Republican district, it has actually decreased. And the same for median income. Here is one number that I found quite impressive. In the same study, they look at all the districts and they compute the part of total GDP generated in Republican district and in Democrat district. The answer is the ratio is 2 to 1. 2/3 of American GDP is generated in districts that have voted in majority for Hillary Clinton during the last election. It's quite impressive because it used to be the case that the Republican used to be seen as the party of wealthy people. Now actually it's the party of declining areas. And if you look by education, you get the same story. So that's the percentage of people voting for the Democrats over time. And what they do is they don't use out-of-the-box polls, because the problem with out-of-the-box polls, you interview people just after voting, and of course you don't know for whom they have voted, and they tell you something, and there is no reason to believe that what they tell you is the truth. Whereas what they do here is statistical. They look at all the various districts. Actually, I think they do that by county. Yes, they do by county. So they look at the average level of education in the county and whether the county votes for the Democrats as the percentage of votes for the Democrats. And you see something that was pretty much regular back until the 90s. And then what you see very clearly is that the educated people tend more and more to vote for the Democrats, and the less educated people tend less and less to vote for the Democrats. In the same paper, they single out 5 states, and of course the reason why they choose those states is that these are swing states. Those are the states in which the election, including the next election, is going to be played. The last election, Trump won because of those states, and it's going to be crucial for the next one. And what you see is that in some states it started early, in some states it's a more recent phenomenon, but now the non-educated people vote Trump, the educated people vote Clinton. So it's a completely different landscape in political terms. Decided that the Republican, they're the party of the wealthy people, and the Democrats, the party of blue collars. First of all, there are not so many blue collars anymore, but the sociology has completely changed. Now the Democrats are, it's the party, well, it's one thing that remains is minorities. Minority vote much more for Democrat than anybody else. But the Democrats tend to be the party of educated people working in a big urban center and with producing a lot of wealth. Okay, I'm done with the description. Let me briefly talk about my own work. The family, that dates back to Gary, right? I'm mentioning the book, but there are plenty of papers between this. There are many gains. Why do people marry? I mean, of course, there is love and all those things. But as economists, we tend to concentrate on economic aspect, and there are many of them. There is specialization, the old story. That there are lots of things to do at home, and so someone has to stay home. It's efficient economically that someone stays home and someone goes on the market and specializes on labor market kind of work and makes the income. By the way, those theories, they fit pretty well the US reality back in the 70s, with one exception, which is still a mystery. How come it's always the wife who stays at home and it's always the husband that goes working? Because if you dig really into this, and in particular, if you adopt a matching perspective, if all the story was specialization, what you should see is actually negative assortative matching. You should see the most educated women marrying an uneducated husband, and the husband stays at home. That would be economically efficient. And by the way, in the original paper, Gary Baker's paper in 73, he knows that. There is a footnote in which he's mentioning that this should be the fact. And it's big time not in the data, absolutely not in the data. And he says, yes, but things are a bit more complex and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that. Another story is public good, and in particular, most important public good in the investment in children. Human capital is what we what we can take from the first part is human capital is much more important now than it used to be. Which means that investing in your children is much more important now than what it used to be. We're going to see what this means in the data, and then there are other things we're sharing or whatever. But if you look at the recent evolutions, first of all, the traditional story specialization and so on basically has disappeared. And there is a beautiful paper by Greenwood, Gunnar, and et al., which is called Engines of Liberation. And it's an empirical paper in which they document the evolution of domestic technology. I'm talking about vacuum cleaners. I'm talking about washing machines. I'm talking about dishwashers, this kind of stuff. And they look at the impact it had on the total number of hours that was required by chores in the house. And this has declined a lot over the last 50 years. Actually, the decline dates back for more than a century. If you look at the time women spent ironing back in the 19th century, you would not believe that. But so this notion that there is a lot of things to do at home, therefore someone has to specialize, it's less and less the case. And the cause is, I think, the technical progress. But on the other hand, investing in children human capital is much more important. Now, why is it important? Because if you look at the main place for the formation of human capital is the family. Not only because everything starts there, but everything we know about the technology of human capital investment tells us that the first few years are completely fundamental in the sense that children who enter the education system, or we reach the age of 7, 8, 9, with a comparative advantage, will actually increase their advantage over the time. I'll come back to that, but in technical terms, it seems that after the age of 7, 8, 9, the technology of human capital production has the various factors are complements. And I think that's absolutely the most important thing in this. So there are multiple factors, innate ability, education, and so on. The parent's time is an input. The human capital is an important factor. I'll come back to that in a minute, but that's the main difference between the initial Beckerian model and what I could call the new Beckerian model, which is if you change the production function within the household by putting parents' education within the production function, you switch from negative assortative matching to positive assortative matching, and it's completely transparent. I will give you a couple of equations just to convince you, but it works. It works by itself. So as I said, the main question is these factors, are they complements of substitute? Because if they're complements, and as I say that after a certain moment they're complements, what does it mean? It means that, for instance, education is good for everyone, but it's especially good for the people who enter the system with an advantage. And it's not only that it's economically efficient to invest on those children. So what we will see is those kids who enter because they come from a more favorable background. They at age 7, 8, they are ahead of the rest. Parents invest much more in their educations, and it's the efficient thing to do. You want to invest where the return is highest. And the return of investment with complement, if the factors are complement, the return on this investment is higher in those families. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this point is that in terms of policy, one thing that policy can do if they are well conceived and well applied is solve some market inefficiencies. One thing that's extremely difficult for any policy to do is to fight something that's economically efficient, because the market forces are really overwhelming. I'll be a bit more specific in a minute. But as I said, we don't know. By the way, that's an absolute shame. We all agree that human capital is crucial. And we all agree that the family is very important. We all agree that investing in human capital within the technology of human capital production within the family is crucial. What do we know about this technology? Pretty much nothing. 20 years ago, it would have been really nothing. There have been some work since then by Jim Heckman, Flavio Cunha, Susan Schenner. We are currently doing some work with Kostas Megir and other people trying to estimate this function. But this question, are they complements or substitutes? That's an empirical question. The only way you can answer this question is by looking at data, and it's not easy because initial ability plays a key role, and it's not unobserved, which means that when you see parents investing more and the outcome being better, is it the investment by the parents that provoke the better outcome, or is it just that kids are better and the parents invest just because the kids are better? I mean, to disentangle those various aspects is difficult, but it has been done, and those papers in particular are very. Now, a light of hope is that if you take early in life, during the first 5-6 years, the factors are probably substitute, which means that if you want an intervention, that's probably the moment to do it. But later, they'll probably complement. Again, to be followed, but that's the direction of what we know now. Okay, let me talk about our work. So this is a paper with Bernard Salenier and Johan Weiss. You take a production function which is Cobb-Douglas. T is the time spent by the wife and the husband, and H is the level of human capital of the wife and the husband. There is no trick here. I'm using the simplest possible production function. There is a little trick because I'm assuming that they're complement, right? The Cobb-Douglas is complement. It would work even if it was not complement, by the way. But preference is their Cobb-Douglas. Q is so think of Q as the level of human capital of the kid. The kid enters the utility function. And what's alpha? Well, alpha tells you to what extent your investment in human capital result in higher utility for the kid, which you internalize in your utility function. So in other words, the fact that it's much more important to be educated now than 40 years ago, we're going to translate it by the fact that alpha is larger now than used to be the case in the past. Now, that's the beauty of matching with transfers. Transferable utility is that you want to, if you have this kind of technology, this kind of preferences, does it give you assortative, positive or negative assortative matching? You compute this animal here and you compute the second cross derivative. And here the answer is positive assortative matching. And by the way, as I said, if you don't put H here, you got negative assortative matching. So that's the difference between the traditional Beckerian approach and the new one that puts more emphasis on the children. And incidentally, I think this was already there 50 years ago. There was assortative matching 50 years ago, despite the fact that the logic of specialization should have pushed in the opposite direction, probably because children have always been part of the picture, but I think much more now than in the past. So what you find here is that now this second cross derivative, it's itself an increasing function of alpha, meaning that if alpha and W is here is simply, I didn't put here, yes, it's here. It's the market value of human capital, which has increased over the period. Now, if you increase W and you increase alpha, the time spent by the parents should increase, in particular by the most educated people, and the incentive to match assortatively should be increased. Now, let me emphasize this point. In a sense, this is counterintuitive. Educated people, the opportunity cost of their time is larger, and they are the people from whom the opportunity time of cost of the time has increased the most. So you could expect that they're going to spend less time on their children, and it's exactly not what's in the data. So these are raw data, but they tell a quite interesting story. If you look at the chores, the total time spent on the chore has decreased, but it has decreased a lot for women and increased a little bit for men, which is exactly what you would expect in an economy in which women are more and more educated and actually more educated than men. But if you look at the time spent with the children, it has doubled for women and it has tripled for men. That's quite spectacular. And if you look at the distinction between most educated and less educated parents, the US are here, so this is for the mother. But you see that in basically all countries, not only it has increased, but it has increased faster for the more educated people than for the less educated people. Again, despite the fact that the cost of their time has exploded over the period. That's for the mom. With one exception, huh? Interesting. You know what FR stands for, right? Yes. And if you look at the dad, even in France, you got this increase on the time spent by the dad. But in all other countries, you see this kind of very clear pattern. Now, what about assortative matching? The model predicts you should have more assortative matching now than in the past. Answering this question, is there more assortative matching now, is incredibly difficult. It's fair to say that we don't have, I mean, I think we have, but we have not yet convinced the rest of the profession that we did. We don't have a kind of simple way of quantifying this. Just to give you an idea of the problem, assume that there are two levels of education, educated and non-educated. And let's just look at married people. By the way, another very important phenomenon is marriage has declined, but has declined a little bit for educated people and hugely for the less educated people, in particular for men in the US. But let's forget about this. Let's think of a 2x2 table. You got educated men, educated women, as you have a 2x2 table and you have the number of couples. And you see two tables like this, before, after, and you ask yourself, do I have an increase in assortativeness? If the number of educated people on both before and after is the same, the answer is very simple. Do I have more people on a diagonal? If it's not, then it's more complex. And to the point that we, in this paper, in the AR paper, we were concluding very strongly that assortative matching has increased a lot, especially at the top of the distribution. In the last issue of the JPE, there is a paper which claims exactly the opposite. That claims that assortative matching has decreased at the top. The reason, of course, is that they have the wrong index. But again, that's exactly what we will try to convince the editor of in the future. Someday I will give you, a technical talk on this because it's absolutely beautiful. But okay, anyway, those numbers they quantify the increase in assortativeness, and in our estimates, they are all positive. There is only one which is negative, but it's not significant. And at the very top of the distribution, there is absolutely no doubt there is this increase in assortativeness. Next step you want to do, you want to explain, if you really believe that assortative pattern are driven by investment on children, you should do a joint estimate of this. i.e., you should jointly estimate the time spent on children, the outcomes in terms of the scores of the children and everything, and the matching patterns. And we have the technology to do that. The only problem is, so far, all the models that we've been using were so-called transferable utility. The nice thing with transferable utility that they make your life much easier, because at the end of the day, all the equilibrium concept boil down to linear maximization, and that, when you do empirical work, makes your life much simpler. But here we don't want that. So there is and by the way, as François said, we want to talk about divorce. It's not difficult to talk about divorce. It's extremely difficult to talk about remarriage. Remarriage is really a pain when you're talking about the market. There are technical issues here, but anyway, that's something that. So the one paper was published, but I was hoping to get the result of the next one. Of course, the most exciting stuff is the stuff that's not yet published. We don't have the result yet, so someday I will come back and present you the result. But let me conclude. What's the takeaway of all this? First of all, human capital accumulation is much more important now than ever in the past. B, the structure of domestic production has changed. Now the dominant aspect is investment in children, which means that we have an additional tendency to homogamy. Which means what? Which means that if you take the most educated people, first of all, they tend, even more than in the past, to marry each other. B, they tend to invest even more in their children. And all those effects are cumulative. The fact that you have a high level of human capital not only has a direct impact on your human capital of the kids, but gives even more value to the investment of time you spend, and gives even more value to investment that your spouse is taking, with the additional twist that your spouse is more educated because there is more assortative matching. So you got this kind of tendency which I call the inequality spiral. The next generation, I expect the inequality among kids to be much higher than the previous one, because there has been much more investment on them. And I expect less and less intergenerational mobility. If you take this kind of theoretical story seriously, it's not surprising that, you know, the graph that I showed, in which the level of mobility was negatively correlated to the impact of human capital on wages, that's exactly what this story is telling you. Inequality, I'm not going to say that inequality is bad per se. As you know, it's a complex debate here. It could be, you know, if inequality is the return of investment in human capital, it might be needed to give the incentive to invest in human capital. But one thing we can all agree on is that inequalities of opportunities, the fact that if you're unlucky enough to be born in the wrong family or in the wrong part of the US or in the wrong community or whatever, the opportunity will be completely different. That's really unacceptable. On the other hand, what we have is a fully efficient mechanism. If we want to fight this, we have to fight against this natural tendency, which is a perfectly rational, perfectly efficient tendency for educated parents to spend much more in time and in money on the education of their children. So what can be, this is a bit pessimistic. I don't see inequality, and you know, that's really, I'm convinced, I show you a couple of graphs, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm deeply convinced as a citizen that you want to explain the Trump phenomenon, this is a very important part of the story. The only light is early intervention. So I was a colleague, and I'm still a close friend of Jim Heckman, and he has spent many years, and he's still working a lot on those kind of issues. Heckman claims, and I think it's absolutely right, that the most profitable investment from a social point of view that you can make is investing on very young kids. Just because, and you know, there has been a number of experiments, the Perry preschool and others. They worked. We're still learning about those experiments, but now we have 30 years and we see the outcomes in terms of, not only in terms of income, but in terms of social pattern, in terms of use of drugs, in terms of crime, this kind of stuff, in terms of probability of getting married, probability of having a family. Actually, we even see this kind of effects on the children of the people of the kids who are treated by the preschool. So if something can be done, it should be very early in life, if possible before the age of 6, 7, 8. I'm done.